Imagine dedicating your entire life to something, giving up family, relationships, personal dreams, only to wake up one day and realize you don't believe in it anymore. This isn't just a story of doubt. This is a story of heartbreak, betrayal, and ultimate freedom. Every year, thousands of priests, pastors, and religious leaders make a decision that shakes the very foundations of faith. They walk away. Some do it quietly, slipping into the shadows, hoping no one notices. Others risk everything to speak out, to tell the world what really happens behind the walls of the church. But why? What makes a man devote decades to faith, only to abandon it all? Today, we're uncovering the hidden struggles priests face behind closed doors, the secret doubts they can never express, the scandals that shattered their faith, the forbidden desires that changed everything. And trust me, what you're about to hear will change the way you see religion forever. Before we dive in, I want to hear from you. Do you think priests should be allowed to question their faith? Should they be able to leave the church without judgment? Drop your thoughts in the comments, because this conversation is just getting started. Let's begin. Faith is supposed to be unshakable. It's the foundation on which millions build their lives. But what happens when the very people who preach that faith, the ones who dedicate themselves to serving God, begin to question everything? For many priests, doubt doesn't come suddenly. It creeps in slowly, like a shadow in the back of their mind, growing larger with every unanswered question. At first, they suppress it, convincing themselves that faith is about trust, not proof. But for some, the questions never stop. They multiply, and soon the doubts become impossible to ignore. Father John was one of them. He was ordained at 25, full of passion, eager to serve. He believed his purpose in life was clear, to guide others closer to God. But over the years, something changed. The more he studied theology, the more contradictions he found. The more he prayed, the more he felt nothing. He confessed his doubts to his superiors, only to be met with warnings, told that questioning was dangerous, that he needed to have more faith. But how do you force yourself to believe something when, deep down, you don't? John spent years battling his own mind. The guilt was unbearable. He wondered if he was failing God or if God had failed him. He stood in front of his congregation every Sunday, delivering sermons he no longer believed in, preaching words that felt like lies. And then, one day, he made the hardest decision of his life. He walked away. He wasn't alone. There are thousands of priests just like John, men who gave up everything to serve the church, only to find themselves trapped in a system that leaves no room for doubt. Many of them are afraid to speak out, terrified of losing the only life they've ever known. But some do. And their stories are more shocking than you can imagine. Some leave because of the doctrine, because they discover contradictions in Scripture, or because science offers explanations that religion refuses to acknowledge. Others leave because they've witnessed corruption, abuse, and scandals hidden behind closed doors. And some leave because they simply can't live the life the church demands of them, because the vow of celibacy is crushing, because loneliness eats away at them, because they fall in love with someone they're forbidden to be with. One former priest, Father Michael, spent years wrestling with guilt over his feelings for a woman in his parish. He tried to bury it, convinced it was a test of his faith. But love isn't something you can switch off like a light. When he finally left the priesthood, he lost everything: his home, his community, the only career he had ever known. But he also gained something he had never truly experienced: freedom. These are the stories the church doesn't want you to hear. These are the stories of men who devoted their lives to God and then walked away. But what does this mean for religion today? If the very people meant to uphold faith are abandoning it, What does that say about the institution itself? Is the church failing its leaders? Or is faith something that was never meant to be controlled in the first place? Let's talk about it. For many priests, leaving the church isn't just about losing a job, it's about losing an identity. From the moment they enter seminary, they are taught that being a priest isn't something you do. It's something you are. It's a lifelong commitment, an unbreakable bond between them and God. But what happens when that bond starts to crack? Father James was raised in a devout Catholic family. As a child, he admired the priests in his parish, watching how they commanded respect, how people looked to them for guidance. By the time he was 18, he had made up his mind. He would dedicate his life to God. The seminary felt like home, a place where he was surrounded by others who shared his faith, his purpose. But what they didn't tell him, what no one ever warned him about, was the unbearable weight that came with it. The moment he was ordained, everything changed. Suddenly, he wasn't just James, he was Father James. People expected him to be perfect, to have the answers to life's hardest questions, to be strong when they were weak. He was the one they turned to when tragedy struck, when loved ones died, when marriages crumbled. He sat with people in their darkest moments, offering comfort, offering hope. But who was there for him? No one prepares a priest for the loneliness. The world sees them as holy men chosen by God, but behind closed doors, many of them struggle with depression, with doubt, with isolation. They are told to turn to prayer, to lean on their faith. But what happens when faith isn't enough? James began having doubts early in his priesthood. At first they were small, questions about certain teachings, about contradictions in Scripture. But over time, those questions grew louder. He found himself standing at the altar, reciting prayers, performing rituals, feeling nothing. He would look out at the congregation, at the people hanging on to his every word, and wonder if he was leading them into a lie. He tried to suppress it. He threw himself deeper into his work, convincing himself that his faith would return if he just prayed harder, if he just believed more. But it didn't. And the more he tried to ignore it, the worse it got. One night, he sat alone in his rectory, staring at the crucifix on his wall, feeling like a fraud. He wanted to scream, to demand answers from the God he had served for so long. But there was only silence. This is the reality for countless priests. They are expected to be unwavering, to be the pillars of faith for their communities. But behind closed doors, many of them are falling apart. The pressure to be perfect, to never question, to always have faith. It's a burden few can carry forever. Some find ways to cope. They bury themselves in their duties, convincing themselves that doubt is just another test. Others turn to unhealthy escapes, drinking in secret, isolating themselves, anything to numb the growing emptiness inside them. And then there are those who can no longer pretend. For James, the breaking point came when a young woman in his parish lost her son in a tragic accident. She came to him sobbing, asking him why. Why would God take her child? Why would he allow such pain? James opened his mouth to give the answers he had been trained to give, to tell her about God's plan, about how suffering has a purpose. But the words caught in his throat because he didn't believe them anymore. That night, he made his decision. He wrote a letter to his bishop, packed a small bag, and walked away from the only life he had ever known. He didn't know what would come next. He had no plan, no job, no idea how to live outside the church. But for the first time in years, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: relief. James's story is not unique. The burden of faith is heavy, and for many priests it becomes unbearable. They are told that doubt is a sin, that leaving the priesthood is a betrayal. But is it? Or is it simply the courage to face the truth? The church teaches that faith should be unwavering, but maybe real faith, the kind that isn't forced, the kind that is truly meaningful, only comes when you have the freedom to question it. And that's exactly what these priests are doing. What do you think? Is doubt a weakness or is it a sign of strength? Let me know in the comments. Faith demands certainty. But what happens when the very people who dedicate their lives to preaching the truth start to question everything they've been taught? What happens when the answers they were given as children no longer make sense? For many priests, doubt doesn't begin with a single moment. It begins with a whisper, a nagging thought in the back of their mind that refuses to go away, a passage in Scripture that doesn't sit right, a doctrine that contradicts another, a prayer that goes unanswered for too long. At first they convince themselves it's just a phase, but for some, the more they seek answers, the more questions they find. Father Daniel had always been a thinker. Even in seminary he had questions, but he was taught that doubt was the devil's way of testing faith. Trust in God, they told him. Not everything needs an answer. So he learned to push his thoughts aside, to ignore the contradictions, to believe without questioning, until one night, years into his priesthood, he found himself alone in the church, staring at the tabernacle and wondering, what if no one is listening? He had spent his life praying for others, offering comfort to the suffering, assuring them that God had a plan. But deep down, he realized he no longer believed the words he was saying. When he looked back at his years of ministry, he saw something terrifying, no clear evidence that God had ever intervened in anyone's life. He thought about the countless people who had begged for miracles, for healing, for signs, the parents who had prayed for their sick children only to bury them days later, the devoted believers who had spent their entire lives in service to God only to be met with tragedy and pain. The truth hit him like a wave. Faith doesn't change reality. People suffer and die no matter how hard they pray. For the first time, he let himself ask the one question he had buried for years. What if we're wrong? And once that question was asked, there was no going back. Daniel isn't alone. There are countless priests who, after years of study, come to see the cracks in their faith. They start to notice contradictions in religious doctrine, places where Scripture says one thing, but church tradition teaches another. They begin to see how much of theology has been shaped by human hands, by politics, by power. One of the biggest struggles for many priests is reconciling their faith with science. The Bible teaches that the world was created in 6 days, yet modern science shows us an entirely different reality. Evolution, the Big Bang, genetics, all of it contradicts the literal teachings of Scripture. And while many churches try to blend faith with science, for some priests, the more they learn, the harder it becomes to pretend these contradictions don't matter. Father Alex was one of them. He had always loved science, even as a child. He had entered the priesthood believing that faith and reason could coexist. But the deeper he went into theological studies, the harder it became to ignore what he was seeing. He saw how religious texts were written, edited, and changed over centuries. He saw how many of the Bible's teachings mirrored older myths and traditions, and he saw how much of what people believe today was shaped by councils, debates, and political agendas rather than divine revelation. One night, after giving a sermon on the power of prayer, he sat in his office, overwhelmed by guilt. He had just told his congregation that faith could move mountains, that God was listening, that miracles were real. But he knew deep down that the world didn't work that way. Science had given us more answers than religion ever had. Am I lying to them? He asked himself. That night, he made the decision to leave. For priests like Daniel and Alex, doubt isn't a moment of weakness. It's an unavoidable reality. When you dedicate your life to truth, you can't ignore it when the truth no longer aligns with what you preach. But the church does not welcome these questions. Priests who express doubt are often silenced, isolated, or pressured to pray harder. They are told that questioning is dangerous, that they are being tested. But what if questioning isn't the problem? What if the real issue is that religion demands blind faith in a world that offers real, tangible answers? For some priests, staying means living a lie. Leaving means losing everything they've ever known. But in the end, they are faced with one simple choice: stay and pretend, or walk away and face the truth. And more of them are choosing to walk away. But if even the most devoted believers, the ones who have dedicated their lives to God, are questioning faith, what does that mean for the future of religion? Faith is supposed to be pure. It's supposed to be a beacon of truth, a guiding light in the darkest moments. But for many priests, the very institution they serve, the church itself, becomes the thing that destroys their belief. For some, the decision to leave isn't because of doubt in God. It's because of what they've seen behind closed doors, the secrets, the corruption, the scandals that never make it to the Sunday sermons. Father Luis had always believed that the church was a force for good. He had spent years defending it, assuring his congregation that despite its flaws, it was built on the foundation of righteousness. But that belief was shattered the day he uncovered a secret buried within his own diocese. It started with whispers, stories of young boys who had come forward, claiming they had been abused by a high-ranking priest. At first, Luis refused to believe it. Not here, not in his church. But when he started digging, what he found was worse than he ever imagined. The priest in question had been accused before. Not once, not twice, but multiple times over the years. And each time, the church had quietly transferred him to another parish, sweeping the accusations under the rug. Documents were hidden, victims were paid off. And Luis realized with growing horror that he was part of a system designed not to protect the innocent, but to protect itself. For weeks, he wrestled with what to do. He brought his concerns to his bishop, expecting outrage, expecting action. Instead, he was told to stay quiet. He was reminded that the church is bigger than one man's sins, that these things must be handled internally, that speaking out would do more harm than good. That was the moment Luis knew he had to leave. The Catholic Church's history of abuse cover-ups is one of the biggest scandals in religious history, but it's far from the only corruption that has driven priests away. For some, it's not the abuse, it's the money. Father Mark had spent years believing the church was devoted to helping the poor, to serving those in need, but as he rose through the ranks, he started to see where the money really went. Lavish homes for bishops, private jets, millions of dollars in donations that never seemed to reach the people they were meant to help. He once asked his superior why the church wasn't using its vast wealth to truly eradicate poverty. The answer: the church must remain powerful to do God's work. It was a justification that didn't sit right with him. He saw struggling families putting their last dollars into the collection plate, believing their sacrifice would bring them blessings. And he saw church leaders living like kings, untouched by the suffering of those who filled their pews. It became impossible to reconcile. For Luis, for Mark, for countless other priests, the church was supposed to be a place of holiness. But behind the curtain, they saw the truth. Politics, power, control. They saw that many of the people leading the church weren't driven by faith. They were driven by greed, by self-preservation, by the desire to hold on to their influence at any cost. And when you see that kind of corruption up close, when you witness it with your own eyes, how do you continue to stand in front of your congregation and pretend that this institution is sacred? Some priests stay silent. They suppress their disgust and convince themselves that the good outweighs the bad. But for others, silence is not an option. They know that by leaving they'll lose everything, their position, their security, their community. But they also know that staying means living a lie. So they walk away. The scandals of the church don't just hurt victims. They don't just shake the faith of believers. They destroy the very men who once swore to defend it. And as more and more priests come forward, exposing the corruption they once tried to ignore, the question becomes, how much longer can the church survive when even its own leaders are turning their backs on it? The struggles of celibacy and isolation. Faith requires sacrifice. At least, that's what every young man entering the priesthood is taught. They are told that giving up worldly pleasures, wealth, family, even romantic love, is a noble path, a higher calling. They believe that their devotion to God will fill the spaces left empty by these sacrifices. But what happens when it doesn't? For many priests, the vow of celibacy is not just a rule, it's a prison. Father Michael was 28 when he was ordained. He had spent years preparing for a life of service, believing that dedicating himself fully to God meant letting go of personal desires. And for a while, he was content. His parish became his family. His faith became his companion. But then he met her. She wasn't a temptation or a distraction. She wasn't someone he pursued with sinful intent. She was simply a woman who listened, who understood, who made him feel for the first time in years like he wasn't alone. At first, it was nothing more than conversation, but over time, he began to realize that his feelings had grown into something deeper. He tried to suppress them, convincing himself that it was a test from God, that resisting was part of his duty. But the more he fought it, the more unbearable it became. He found himself questioning why love, the very thing he preached about every Sunday, was forbidden to him. Why a natural human connection was considered sinful. He had spent his life telling people that love was a gift from God, but now he was being told that love was the one thing he could never have. The guilt consumed him. He prayed for clarity, for strength, for the feelings to disappear, but they didn't. And then one night he asked himself a question he had been too afraid to face. What if God never wanted this for me? Michael isn't alone. Thousands of priests struggle with the burden of celibacy, trapped in a system that demands they deny one of the most fundamental parts of being human. Some suffer in silence. Others break their vows in secret, engaging in hidden relationships that could destroy their careers if exposed. And some, like Michael, reach a breaking point where they can no longer lie to themselves. But celibacy isn't the only struggle. Loneliness is just as devastating. For most people, friendships, family, and intimate relationships are sources of emotional support. But for priests, these connections are limited. They live alone. They eat alone. They sleep alone. They counsel others through their struggles, but have no one to turn to when they need help. Father David described it as a slow erosion of the soul. At first, he thought his faith would be enough to sustain him, but over the years, he began to feel like a ghost, like he existed only to serve others while no one truly saw him. He watched as his childhood friends got married, had children, built lives filled with love and companionship, while he spent his nights in an empty rectory, wondering if he had made a mistake. Some priests turned to unhealthy escapes, alcohol, secret affairs, even self-harm, just to cope with the crushing weight of isolation. Others suffer in silence, their mental health deteriorating until they can no longer function. The church tells them that their sacrifice is noble, that it brings them closer to God. But what if that sacrifice is breaking them instead? Many priests who leave the church don't do so because they've lost faith in God. They leave because they've realized that the rules imposed by the church are unnatural, unrealistic, and in many ways, inhumane. Michael eventually left the priesthood to be with the woman he loved. It wasn't an easy choice. He lost his job, his community, and the only life he had ever known. But for the first time in years, he felt truly whole. David left too. He decided that a loving relationship with another human being didn't make him unworthy of God's grace. He realized that he didn't have to choose between faith and happiness. He could have both. These stories are becoming more common. More and more priests are questioning the vow of celibacy, asking why the church continues to enforce a rule that so many are unable to keep. And the biggest question of all, if even Jesus' disciples were married, why can't priests be? The struggles of celibacy and isolation. Priests are taught that sacrifice is the ultimate sign of devotion. They enter the priesthood knowing they will give up money, personal ambitions, and most importantly, romantic relationships. They are told that celibacy isn't just a rule, but a gift, a way to stay pure and committed solely to God. But what happens when that sacrifice becomes unbearable? Father Michael had always believed in the vow of celibacy. As a young seminarian, he admired priests who spoke of their devotion to God, who claimed that denying worldly pleasures made them stronger in faith. He thought he could do the same, but no one prepared him for the loneliness. For years, he poured himself into his ministry, counseling couples, baptizing children, and officiating weddings, moments of love and connection that he himself would never be allowed to experience. He convinced himself that the absence of romantic love in his life was a noble sacrifice. But deep down, he felt something missing. Then he met her. She wasn't someone he sought out. She wasn't a temptation he tried to resist. She was simply a person who listened, who understood, who saw him as a human being, not just a priest. At first, their conversations were harmless, discussions about books, philosophy, life outside the church. But over time, something changed. For the first time in years, Michael felt something that had been buried beneath years of religious duty, longing. He tried to fight it. He prayed harder. He threw himself into his work. He reminded himself that his commitment to God came first. But no amount of prayer could change the fact that he was human, and no amount of self-discipline could erase the reality that love, the very thing he preached about, was now forbidden to him. Michael's story is not unique. Across the world, thousands of priests struggle with the vow of celibacy, forced to deny a fundamental part of their humanity. Some suffer in silence, convincing themselves that this is simply the price they must pay for their faith. Others secretly break their vows, engaging in hidden relationships that could destroy their reputations if exposed. And then there are those, like Michael, who reach a point where they can no longer live a lie. But celibacy is only part of the struggle. The loneliness that comes with it is just as devastating. For most people, emotional support comes from family, close friends, and romantic partners. Priests, however, live a life of isolation. They eat alone, sleep alone, and bear the burdens of their parishioners without anyone to turn to when they themselves need comfort. Father David described it as a slow suffocation. At first, he convinced himself that faith was enough to fill the emptiness. But as years went by, he found himself waking up every morning feeling more and more like a ghost, existing only to serve others, while no one truly saw him. He officiated weddings, but would never have one of his own. He baptized children, but would never experience fatherhood. He counseled people through heartbreak, but had no one to hold him when he was hurting. And then came the moment that broke him. One evening, after presiding over a funeral for a long-time parishioner, David returned to his small, empty rectory. He sat down, looked at the four walls surrounding him, and felt an overwhelming wave of despair. He had spent his life bringing comfort to others, but when he needed it most, there was no one to turn to. The crushing loneliness became unbearable. David, like many other priests, eventually made the painful decision to leave the priesthood. It wasn't because he had lost faith in God. It was because he had come to realize that the rules imposed by the church were unnatural, unrealistic, and deeply damaging. The Catholic Church teaches that celibacy is necessary, that it allows priests to be fully devoted to God. But history tells a different story. Celibacy was not always required. Many early Christian leaders were married. Even the Bible mentions that some of Jesus' disciples had wives. So why does the church still cling to this rule? Many former priests believe that the enforcement of celibacy isn't about holiness, it's about control. It ensures that priests remain dependent on the church, that they have no families to support them if they ever decide to leave. But the cracks are starting to show. More and more priests are questioning celibacy, and some branches of Christianity have already abandoned it. The question now is, will the Catholic Church ever follow? Michael left the priesthood and chose love over duty. David walked away realizing that faith and happiness didn't have to be mutually exclusive, and thousands of others are beginning to do the same. So now, the question is for you. Should priests be allowed to marry? Should the church change its stance on celibacy? Let's talk in the comments. What this means for religion. Today, for centuries, priests have been seen as the pillars of faith, men who dedicate their lives to God, unwavering in their devotion. But what happens when even they begin to question? What does it mean when the very people who preach belief, who lead prayers, who guide others in their spiritual journeys, decide to walk away? The truth is, religion is changing. More priests than ever are leaving the church, and they aren't leaving because they've lost their morals. They aren't leaving because they're weak. They're leaving because they've seen too much, questioned too much, and realized that the life they were promised doesn't always align with the truth. Some leave because their faith crumbles under the weight of doubt. They can no longer reconcile ancient teachings with modern knowledge. Others leave because they can no longer stomach the corruption, the scandals, the hypocrisy that exists behind closed doors. And many leave because the rules imposed upon them, rules of celibacy, of isolation, of sacrifice, are slowly breaking them apart. But here's the bigger question. If so many priests are leaving, what does that say about the institution itself? For years, churches have told people that faith is absolute, that questioning is dangerous, that leaving is a betrayal. But the reality is, faith should never be forced. If a belief system cannot withstand scrutiny, if it crumbles when challenged, then maybe it was never as strong as it claimed to be. The world is changing, and the church is struggling to keep up. People are demanding answers, they're demanding change, and more, they're refusing to follow blindly without questioning the system that claims to hold the truth. So what happens next? Will the church adapt? Will it finally listen to the voices of the priests who have walked away? Or will it continue to push forward unchanged, even as its foundations weaken? That's where you come in. Do you think the church needs to evolve? Should priests be allowed to marry? Should the institution be held accountable for the secrets it keeps? Or do you believe faith should remain the way it has always been? Let's have this conversation. Drop a comment below, because this is a debate that affects not just priests, but the future of religion itself. And remember, faith is a journey, not a prison. And sometimes the bravest thing you can do is walk away.